York is among several cities taking action on police reform amid the nationwide demonstrations. The city has had some of the largest protests in the country, including since the killing of George Floyd 3 weeks ago. Large-scale protests were even held last weekend when an estimated 15,000 people gathered at the Brooklyn Museum. Their message was to demand justice for Black transgender lives. According to the New York Times, the movement is being led by young, charismatic leaders in the city who are drawing large crowds and taking on the establishment. Jamel Mims is one of those activists. He's also an organizer of the group Refuse Fascism. Welcome, Jamel. Great to have you with us. What has made New York's protests so successful in terms of turnout? In particular, these large numbers of young people who are coming to these demonstrations.
Thanks so much for having me. I think this is a situation where everyone is coming really to terms with how white supremacy is systemic, how it's woven into the very fabric of this system, and how it can't be reformed. And people are waking up to the need to actually drive this white supremacist, fascist head of state that's in the White House out of office, and the fact that this entire system needs to be overthrown. Part of the energy of what's been going on here in New York has been people here who have actually been really driven to think and imagine what it'll take to get to a world without police murder. And so you see people of all ages, all persuasions, all sexual orientations who are actually a part of this. People who aren't directly affected by policies like stop and frisk or police murder, but who say that this is our fight. This is my fight, too. And so this is a big part of the ethos and part of what has made these protests such a huge deal in New York City and around the country. But it's also a huge reminder of where things really need to go.
And of course, there's no one leader of these protests, largely due to the decentralized nature of how these protests work. Is that benefiting the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think part of this is that we've seen, more change over the past 15 years, over the past 15 days than we've seen over the past 15 years. And this has been, in large part to the great diversity of leaders and leadership that's actually been coming forward to fill this. Young people have actually been at the forefront of these protests and these marches. And this has, it has shifted the conversation around police murder and around, getting rid of the police in the society and what kind of society would actually take to get there. It's actually totally shifted that conversation. And so these protests and this movement in the street has actually been what's been responsible for this. And so it's really benefited, the movement in a large part, but in terms of what goals has it actually accomplished, we really have to keep our eye on the ball of has this actually ended police murder? Has this actually gotten us any closer to a world where young Black and brown people can walk down the street without fear of being gunned down by those that are trained to protect them? And so, through the process and how this has happened, you see politicians come out, with, talks to abolish the police without talks of abolishing an actual system that, brutalizes and oppresses people and relies on the police to enforce that oppression. And so, we actually need to get rid of that system. And so it's more than, making the Black Lives Matter movement, better. It's amazing that this is global and worldwide, but we actually really have to keep our eye on the ball about what kind of world can we create where Black and brown young people live lives worthy of human beings, and not just them, all of humanity.
And we have seen, some action already. We've seen Mayor Bill de Blasio agree to make some cuts to the NYPD budget. Governor Cuomo signed several reforms, including a chokehold ban and a repeal to 50A, that law that helped police shield misconduct records. Are you satisfied with these measures? And if not, what else do you think you can get politicians to agree to?
This is a time where it's shown more than anything that the power has not actually come from the politicians, but it's actually come from people in the streets. And, like I said before, those 15 days that felt like 15 years of change has actually been driven by young people in the streets. It's actually been driven by mass, sustained, nonviolent protests. And this is a model that all over the world in 2019, we saw in places like in Seoul, South Korea, We saw in, way back in, I believe, 2012 in Egypt with Tahrir Square, in Puerto Rico, in Hong Kong, these days after days, night after night, these types of protests that actually drive systemic change. And, so in terms of relying on politicians for this, I think we actually need to rely on people to actually transform this situation and take it to where it needs to go. We're not going to actually be able to make Black Lives Matter in this society with a fascist white supremacist that's actually in the White House calling for KKK rallies during, in Tulsa for Black Wall Street, on Juneteenth. Come on. We actually have to see that this is the second president of the Confederacy and that this movement needs to actually go towards driving them out in the way that they did in these other countries. Brutal regimes hate nothing more than millions of people continuing to be out on the streets. And so I really think that's where we should put our hopes in, continue to put our hopes in the people. And, politicians will fall in line where they will.
So when you say we need to take this where it needs to go, that's what you mean, that you mean a new administration in the White House?
I mean, look, this movement has the potential, and we've seen it all over the world, where, 18 countries worldwide, over 100 cities, in the U.S., places where there virtually are no Black people are taking up this cause. This movement put the president in a bunker. Why should we set our sights so low as to only get a few more elected faces of leadership? This can actually be a movement that drives this president out of the White House now, and as part of that, actually working to a world, to actually get to a place where you can have Black and brown people, free of white supremacy, free of oppression and brutality, to get to that kind of world. Just by comparison, like, look, that actually takes a revolution. It took, federal marshals enforcing desegregation, for that to actually be enforced. That's what it'll actually take. And if folks, this is a time where people actually need to be investigating and digging up that history. But the urgent thing, as you were saying, is actually this fascist white supremacist in the White House, and where this movement needs to go is towards driving Trump and Pence out now.
All right. Well, Jamel Mims, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.